Hello students, a brief video this week on foreshadowing and through-lines, spoilers for nearly every story that we've gone over in the fiction unit. Let's start out with foreshadowing. This is hinting at the future. There are three main ways that you can do this. And the first is using description, which we see in the story of an hour. Chopin uses the description of the room, the open square, the twittering birds, all that stuff, to hint at our character's mood. This is foreshadowing because we as readers don't know explicitly how that character feels until we get past all of this positive description. There are other ways that you can use description like this as well, and it doesn't have to be just about mood. If you have a bunch of characters gathered at a table and one of the characters is wreathed in shadow, or the sunbeam is only falling on one character, those can tell us things about the characters or can count as foreshadowing. If like you kill off the character who's wreathed in shadow, or if they turn out to be evil at the end, that character with the beam of light on them isn't just blinded by the light in their eyes, but they actually turn out to be like a force for good or something like that. I don't know. But these are all ways that you can use description and setting as foreshadowing. The next way is if you have characters who are faced with similar situations multiple times through the story, your characters will often act or think the same way every time they're faced with this. There are many different kinds of similarities that can work, like different similar conflicts or a similar location or whatever. But any time that a character has some kind of similar situation, the first can always foreshadow everything that comes after. And we'll have a specific example of this in just a bit. The final way that I want to talk about is any actual discussion of the future, which is a very blunt way to foreshadow. You have characters saying, this is what I think is going to happen next, and then it happens, or something like it happens. It's blunt, like I said, but it still works. And let's start out with an example of that final type. The top of page 4 in the version of Sunny's Blues that I sent out to you, the PDF that you can get on Blackboard, we have a conversation between our narrator and Sunny's friend. And here in this conversation, you can see that our narrator has asked Sunny's friend what's going to happen, what Sunny's life is going to be like in the future, and the friend says that it's just going to start all over again. Our narrator interprets this to mean that Sunny wants to die. He's using heroin because he wants to die, and the friend says he don't want to die, he wants to live, don't nobody want to die ever. So they're talking about what's going to happen after Sunny gets out. And after Sunny gets out, by the end of the story, we learn that these things are true. Sunny doesn't want to die, and the friend said that it just starts all over. Well, Sunny definitely wants to live. The friend was right about that. But his notion of how he wants to live is very different from the narrator's idea of what a good life is like. And we also know that, as the friend says, it's just going to start all over again. Sunny knows that he is not over his addiction. He may go back to heroin someday. But the way our narrator and the way we think about those facts has changed over the course of the story because of the way Sunny and the narrator's relationship has changed. Here's the two similarities or similar situations coming up. An example of that is in Rules of the Game, which is from this week, I guess. It opens with a very short conflict between the mother and the daughter, where the mother wins because the daughter's very young. The mother is the mother, and it's like a battle of wills, and the mother comes out on top. But it's really short, and most of the action of the story is based around the daughter's progression in chess. Our narrator learning to play chess and being better at it than her brothers, and then being better at it than nearly everyone else. As the story reaches the final conflict, as it builds up to that moment of climax, we can see the final conflict coming, right? In the way that the narrator begins to resent her mother's actions. And if the author has done a good job, some readers are going to remember that initial conflict and they're going to think, okay, well, I see what's coming. They might think that the narrator has changed enough, has learned enough about chess to know how to deal with this conflict, but still they know that this is coming. Other readers might have forgotten about that initial conflict. It may exist in the back of their mind, but they've forgotten about it mostly. And then when they do see the final conflict, they're reminded of that first conflict. It has that resonance with them, which helps the reader feel like they understand the story, like it connects together. One final, well, I guess 3 final notes about foreshadowing. Subtlety, like what we see in Chopin, where it's the details, the setting, things that you describe, those things are generally more subtle ways of foreshadowing. And that kind of subtlety is good. It's not necessary, though. You can use these other ways. You can explicitly talk about the future. You can have similar situations. That's fine. It's good, though, to give your reader the opportunity to feel smart, and that subtle foreshadowing using detail is a really good way to let your readers feel smart. That's a positive feeling that they're going to get from your story if they interpret details correctly. All right, let's move on to talk about through lines. These are a tactic that you can use in writing a story that helps you give the impression that a character existed before the story happened and will exist after, as long as they don't die. And this sort of thing helps the reader believe in the characters, because every character has a past, unless they're born during the story, and every character has a future unless they die during the story. If it's done well, then your reader is going to consider how the changes that come about throughout the story are going to make the characters act as their future happens. So in Sunny's Blues, by the end of the piece, if these characters feel real to you, you are thinking about how these characters are going to interact with each other, how Sunny and the narrator are going to behave toward each other. Is our narrator going to be supportive? Is Sunny going to go back to use heroin? And how will our narrator act about that? And how does our narrator think about Sunny's music? And so on and so on. So if the author has done a good job, you're going to think about that. In Cathedral, we know that our narrator has been a jerk in the past. He doesn't have any friends. And in the future, now that he's made one friend, maybe his life will change. And Cathedral was a bonus story. It's pretty short. You can go read it now. Rules of the game. Again, by the end of this story, we see that our narrator has had 2 shots at this sort of battle of wills with her mother. How is this going to affect her in the future? These through lines, or the notion of through lines, applies less maybe, or maybe just in a different way, when we have a sort of mixed up chronology like we have in Apollo, and to a lesser extent in Bullet in the Brain, which we'll see next. So instead, Apollo, remember, we start in the future, and then our narrator is reminded of something that happened in their past, so then they go back and narrate these important series of events from their childhood. And then there's a long break between that past and the present that starts the story. So instead of us thinking about the narrator's past, we think about the time between that event when our narrator claims that Raphael pushed them off the porch, and this moment when they're thinking about Raphael again. We see how not only the narrator's life must have gone, they must have continued lying to their parents about their sexuality, they must have continued lying to their parents about what happened with Raphael, they must have hidden everything and continued to feel like they were making their parents ashamed of them throughout this life to make them have that introductory scene with their parents. We're also probably thinking in maybe a less detailed way about how Raphael's life must have gone from that incident. We know that now he's fallen in with a band of thieves, and it's because our narrator lied about him and made it so that he probably couldn't get another job, especially not another job working in someone's house. Another way that we can apply through lines to that story is to think about how our narrator remembering these events and realizing what happened to Raphael, how is this going to affect the narrator? That's the wrong word. It should say, also think about how remembering this will affect the narrator now. So how is this character going to move forward with their life now that they know they basically ruined Raphael's life and got him potentially killed? All right, here's Bullet in the Brain and the story of an hour. In here, the main characters are dead by the end of the piece, so we can't have a forward through line that goes beyond the end of the story. Instead, in order for these stories to have a good impact, we must make the character's past feel fleshed out. And what we see here are two very different approaches. In Bullet in the Brain, the main character dies basically, or is definitely going to die by the end of the first scene. That happens very quickly. And then the past is given these brief, detailed flashes. And if our author has done a good job here, we can build up a very good idea of what Anders' life was like from the time when he was on this ball field as a kid and just overjoyed about this rhythm of language that he's heard, and how he progressed from there to this sour old critic who gets shot in a bank because he can't shut up. So those are actual details that we get, very specific things. In the story of an hour, instead, we have hints about the character's past. Mrs. Mallard thinks about how Mr. Mallard was always kind to her, how she never had any cause to complain, but yet she's going to be happy to be free. She also thinks about the bonds that other people have with her, and she doesn't think of them as sort of ties or connections between people. She thinks of them as actual chains that are holding her down. Another thing that we get about her past is that other people believe that she must have been happy. So we look at the very few details that we have here, and we can build up a picture of what her life is like. Instead of a specific idea like Bullet in the Brain, instead we have a very emotional idea. She must have been internally somewhat miserable throughout her life married to Mr. Mallard, for her to die at the end of this when she realizes that he hasn't died. Brutal. Overview of Through-lines. The goal is to make the character feel real by giving details about their past and giving the reader enough to think about the future. And if you do this well, their story is going to have more impact because your reader walks away from it thinking about what's going to happen next, how their life is going to change. They believe that that character is real, that they change and adapt because of what has happened to them. And in the case where the characters are killed, they're left thinking about, oh, how did they get to this place? What was their life like before? That's the question of those stories. And it's important at this point to remember that unless your character dies, every human, every real character will always have more conflicts. No one's life is ever solved completely. And, sometimes you see this in fairy tales, but you're mostly looking at someone's life being happier or them being happy in the moment instead of them actually living their life happily ever after.